Just 3 years ago, I read this exact book, but I forgot 90% of what I read. That's why I created a 3-step process that allows me to remember anything. And you know what the scary part is? It actually works. The first step is intaking information. But did you know only 5% of what you listen to is actually recalled and remembered? My senior year of high school, instead of going to school, I spent all day, every day, 10 plus hours listening to podcasts, reading books, doing everything that I thought I possibly could to learn as much as possible. But do you know what happened? 6 months went by and I didn't actually learn anything. I didn't remember all the stuff that I was consuming all day, every day. I was trapped in this perpetual feedback loop of just consuming social media, consuming information, listening to podcasts, thinking I was under the false belief that I was then going to have some sort of magical awakening and become successful. But after 6 months, if you asked me any question on any of these macroeconomic subjects that I was studying, on any of these business subjects, I could have told you the end result, how people got to the answer very well. I remembered the end result as if you would in school. But what I didn't know was the process to how people get to that conclusion. And the conclusion doesn't matter as much as the process to actually getting there. The harsh reality was I wasn't actually learning. I was under the false belief that the more information I poured into my brain, the better I would be at remembering it and turning it into my own ideas, but that simply wasn't true. I thought I had to double down and listen to more podcasts. I actually thought that I just wasn't working hard enough. That's why I wasn't absorbing the information and being able to articulate it. But the reality was that is just not how humans are designed to learn. The second part, after you actually absorb the information, you have to write it down. Right now, I run a social media marketing quasi agency helping 8 and 9 figure entrepreneurs scale their social media so they can get significantly more customers for their business. And in my work, 99% of the value comes from the quality of what I'm producing, and most of it is creative work. If I wrote down 100 ideas for my clients and I only use one of them, I actually just wasted a ton of time. I spent my time producing 100 widgets and only got one result. Therefore, when I have a great idea, I have to emphasize on the importance of it to a very high degree. That means if I'm at the gym, if I'm in the shower, sometimes even if I'm sleeping, if I get a great idea and I wake up, I know that I'm gonna forget that information if I let it go for 30, 40, even 10 minutes. That means I will quite literally, I do this at least once a week, get up out of bed when I'm sleeping, go walk to my phone, which I keep far away from me because I don't want the EMF all over me, open it up and text myself whatever it is that idea was because I want to be able to remember it the next day. And second part is I just text myself every single day, probably 30, 40, 50 times. PJ's behind the camera right now. I put him in a group chat with myself, so he's forced to listen to me speak. We spend all day with each other. When we're not together, I'm texting me and him at the exact same time. But it actually does help a substantial amount because when you hear something, scientifically, you are only absorbing 5% of what you are doing. When you're reading it, it's 10. But when you're writing it down and forcing yourself to articulate those thoughts that are in your head or that I just heard from, let's say, Robert Kiyosaki, one of the guys that I work with, or Ken, these guys make hundreds of millions of dollars. When they give me a great idea that I want to remember, I need to take their idea, because that's what it is their idea, and turn it into my own. And I can do that by writing down what they just told me, which that will allow me to remember, say 50% of what they are talking about. So this third step is by far the most important. It's how I increased my learning speed and ability by over 1000%. After I listen to something, I write it down. After I write it down, I make a video actually teaching it. You go from absorbing 5% of information to 90% because the most important part is not having an end conclusion. When you listen to a podcast or a short Instagram reel and you get that short snippet of, let's say, great information that everyone repeats over and over and over again, you would think, okay, that means everyone should have these massive businesses. But it doesn't matter if you have the end result if you can't fill in all the details. And the only way to fill in those details is understanding, because the goal is not to just have the right answer, but to know how you get to the right answer. Or at least that's the only way you can run a functionable business, because you won't be able to tell them what to do or show them how to do it if you don't know how to do it yourself, if you can't teach it. And teaching it is actually what helps me learn it at such an exponential rate. So every single day with Every idea that I have, I write it down. I constantly listen to, much less now, but I used to listen to nothing but podcasts. And all the main snippets while I'm walking or at the gym, I would just text them to myself. And then later in that evening, I would just make a video on it, which I've been doing for over a year now, just making a video every single day. And I can't even articulate how valuable that's been from the rate of growth of my learning. Because when you're working every day, you still forget. When you're practicing something, you're only learning 70% of what you're doing. You actually learn more from teaching it to someone else than you do from practicing it. I'm learning something, I'm practicing all day in my business, trying to grow, trying to do different things. And then I talk about that later in the night. That allows so much room for real growth, which is the goal. And this is how I've almost created a system by accident to remember anything that is really important. Anytime something's important, I always make sure I make a video on it because that's how I actually understand it to the highest degree.